Hey, Composing Gloves here, and this is the first video in the Learn to Make Chiptune series. In this series, I will be teaching the basics of making chiptune. We'll be making some chiptune and all the principles that go behind making a chiptune. And I will be using renoise for this, but because I'm taking a principle-based approach, it will not matter what DAW you're using. This comes with a little bit of the stipulation. It means that you have to already know somewhat about the program you're using. So if you're a renoise user, good news for you. I also have a basic series for learning renoise if you've never, because I'm not going to be explaining how it works. I'm just going to be jumping straight into the composition. So if you're working in Ableton or FL or whatever program you're using, Moki Tracker or whatever, you'll be able to follow along. So don't be intimidated if this is like a software that's sort of foreign to you. I'm using this because I've done most of my chiptune compositions in it, and I wanted to do them in here because this is the way it used to be made. So I have like other reasons for using this. And it's amazing as a DAW. It forced me to think really differently. So we're going to be looking at that. So those are just a couple of things you should know ahead of time. Nothing extraordinary. Just check out the recommended series links below. And those are all the series that I recommend you at least have some knowledge of before you jump into something like this. For general composition, nothing too nuts. So let's go. What is chiptune? Chiptune is music that was originally made from actual chips. So you had like a computer chip, and you would use this chip, and it would generate your music. And it was because these were like the first things the first ways to make computer music. And so they became known as chiptunes. And there's been this evolution. So some of you guys think chiptune, and we have sort of some different understandings. And some of you have a way good understanding. Like you have a differentiation between 8-bit and chiptune, which is really good. So we're going to start at like the very beginning, right? You have these tunes. You were limited to very basic waveforms, things like saw waves. You were limited to square waves, triangle waves. Just not a lot of options. And you usually had a noise generator, and that's what you used to make your snare drum. And so you just had very limited options. Eventually the ability to use samples came along, and there's like a whole side story about that, but I'm going to ignore all like the extra side story stuff. You can go research it on your own. But anyways, the ability to use sample came along, and so samples began to get incorporated. And this is where like there was a whole bunch of weird ways to make this music. There wasn't like a standard software. That's when trackers sort of came around. And so this is a tracker, and what it was is you'd put a list of instructions down. This is not how trackers used to look though. This is like very modern tracker. But you would put down your samples, right? And you would have like a bank of sounds of samples or of synthesizers or whatever, some sort of sound set, and then you would give it instructions to change over time. So you'd be like, oh, play this note, then play this note, then turn off, then play this note, so on and so forth. And that was how you'd make your music. And so I stick largely to these limitations, but if you go a bit further in time, and we're getting into like, around in the 80s, we had FM synthesis, right? And then in the 90s, though, it really began to show up a lot more in music as chiptune music. Like it appeared beforehand, but like the big staples that like made it what it is appeared mostly in the 90s. And so FM synthesis came around. I don't use FM a ton in my chiptune, but it begins to shift sort of towards like house, and we're getting into more modern stuff. Early 2000s, FM synthesis was everywhere in chiptune, and a couple other techniques. A very common technique. This one was actually near the heyday of when it was sort of coming out. Chiptune was new. Was they would use square waves. And if you used, depending on the system you were using, because if you used the Commodore, you had full control over the duty cycle of the square wave, whereas the Game Boy, I believe, only gave you like incremental abilities to change the duty cycle, which is so you have a square wave, right, that looks like that. And so it's how much of that time is a wave spent being up that's referred to as your duty cycle. That's an easy way of thinking about it. So then we get to what some of you guys think are chiptune, which is really just has chiptune influence. So think of like a good artist would be like Nitro Fun from Monster Cat, the label Monster Cat. It's chiptune elements. It's very heavily chiptune emphasized, but it's got a really modern sound, and they're using modern techniques. They're using modern ways to generate sounds. All these things that weren't available back then, but it's got the vibe of chiptune because they're using like the same basic sort of rules and There's a couple techniques that are staples of chiptune that if you use this technique, you've pretty much got yourself a chiptune song. So those sorts of things, they are chiptune, but they're not chiptune in the real sense. They're definitely not 8-bit. 8-bit, it has its own set of rules. Like everything has to be 8 bits. So I'm not going to be covering like 8-bit, but I will be covering chiptune as a broader spectrum, obeying most of the rules that I just told you. And if you obey these rules, you're pretty much good. Now, one rule I do break is I use modern samples, obviously. So my drums have a little bit more of a modern vibe. Some of them I use an older vibe, and I use some techniques that are common to tracking now that to generate my songs. So for example, one very common thing to do is you come in here and you will draw your own waveform and you'll use that as your sound. So like, oh, let me draw one, and bang, I just drew my waveform and I can now use this as one of my sounds. So it's got reverb because it's going through a track already. It's going through the lead track, so that's why it already has reverb. So that is what we are going to be looking at. Yeah, undo that just a couple times. All right, so let me give you just a quick example. So this is one of the tracks, and we're going to be looking at principles. Near the end, we will do a lot more composition, but we got to get ourselves set up so that we know what our goal is and we know what the general, like, how do they start their songs? What's those sorts of things. Getting the sounds up and running is like the easiest thing in the world. Just go in and load up a sample and then just play that sample. So as you see, this entire song has 4 sawtooth waves, and then it's got some drums, and that's it. And that's usually is how it goes. They're just really simple. We can get a lot more complicated if we toss in FM and do a whole bunch of other stuff, but I wanted to stay to like the really basic like limitations. That to me was like the challenge of it. So I'll go ahead and play it. Now I do not hold myself back on effects, as you can see. So it's sort of cheating that way. But here is what this sounds like. I'm gonna play up to like when the drop hits. Also, it's gonna sound really noisy just because of the method I record my tutorials with. It's not actually that noisy when you hear the sound. You're gonna hear like shh on the lead and stuff. Just that's the way it's gonna be because it's gonna be like a way more work to change my setup. So just so you know. Okay, so here we go. So there you go. That's a taste of what we were going to be that's like what I look at as chiptune. I have other sillier songs. Maybe I can open one real quick. So this is another example of a chiptune. So chiptune, there's some that are like way more drum based. There's some that have like that modern feel. So that definitely is like a little bit more modern of a chiptune song. It's not got like that old school. Obviously, the drums are like way more modern. But this is like an example of something that's quite a bit older. The drums are they're not as modern as the last set. But here we go. Oh, I have a loop on, but you get the idea. It's just a funny little tune that's like na 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 na. That's another thing that they're very popular, just silly little tunes. It's another thing that you can do. So you can look at it more of like It's just like a piano, only it's now you're composing with the electronic sounds for a video game rather than that old piano sound to get the same nostalgic vibe. So anyways, those are some examples. There's some pretty contrasting examples just to show you there's just a huge variety. You could be super sad, you could be super excited. Typically, a chiptune is thought of being like this sort of key-gen, upbeat music, but you could totally do sad and depressed. There's tons of that too. So if you have any questions, let me know. I'm excited to be sharing this information with you. I wish I had someone to show it to me. And have a blessed day.